Hi, Leslie.
Hello.
John, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead. And then where would you like me to start?
Why don't you start and introduce me and we can go from there.
Okay, so we have today a moderator, a friend of mine who's assisting now with these town halls. He does this professionally. I've known John for over a decade, and he has been an activist in social and political causes in our area of northeastern Pennsylvania. He's very well known, and also is a leader in the LGBT community. He has his own consulting group, but has worked for larger concerns and continues to work with local and local businesses as well as on the state level. And is an expert in e-commerce and has a really broad skill set. So it would take a long time for me to really properly introduce him without a prepared statement. But thank you, John, for arranging to join us and be part of these town halls and assist with the overall structure of these meetings.
No problem. I am currently attempting to start the live stream. So I guess we'll just have you start with an update. And I know that you had posted something on your Facebook that I will attempt to throw up on the screen here. Maybe we can start here and go from there.
Okay, so these are today's numbers, and really these numbers are no longer, they're no longer a cause for any fear. I would say that these are clearly distressing numbers. They are a result of a failure of the first stage of any epidemic or pandemic response, which is containment. So we're clearly seeing that some countries were very, very good at containment, like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And the reason they were very good at that is they used the epidemiology 101, which is track and trace. So identifying patient zero and then understanding how the transmission proceeded through the community at a very, very early stage so that they could contain it. So obviously containment was never even contemplated in our country and by our apparatus, so to speak. We're now in mitigation phase, and mitigation has also pretty much entirely is failing. Every day for the last 2 weeks, we have seen a massive increase in case numbers, which is expected to a very large degree because when you don't have any containment and no idea of the latency of the disease, for example, how long has it been here? In which communities is there a very high load of asymptomatic patients? And how long have these patients been shedding? All of these questions were not answered because they were never asked. There was no testing. And so, like I said, this is no cause for fear at all. It is distressing to look at, nearly 30,000 new cases in one day, but that's just a result of now pushing, tens of thousands of tests out there into these various hotspots and it's basically a big flashlight, right? You've got this huge dark space, and every time you do 10,000 tests, it's like a flashlight on that particular community. And then you finally see that these have been going on. So this has a lag or latency of 2 to 3 weeks. These people were infected 2 or 3 weeks ago and now are showing symptoms and now being tested and now being admitted to hospital. The other lagging number is in red, which is the number of deaths. Again, we talked about last week the difference between the rate of death, which is obviously now measured in 24 hours in each of these countries and within our country, within communities. The more important number to look at, as I described, is mortality. Mortality is a confirmed coronavirus case, admitted for treatment, has gone through standard protocol of treatment, and has died as a result of the infection. So that is a true mortality rate that serves us epidemiologically in understanding the infection and all of its all of the things that go along with that in each individual patient. So the mortality rate right now in the United States is probably around 2.5 to 2.8%. But I'm hearing from all over the country that certain hospitals are attributing coronavirus deaths inappropriately, and other hospitals, especially in Florida, are not attributing them at all. And that are just, if the patient is in the hospital with coronavirus symptoms but has comorbidities, they will consider the comorbidity the cause of death before the infection. So we continue to screw up gathering of appropriate epidemiological data to really get our hands around this pandemic, because we're allowing the states to operate by their own rules, and that messes everything up. That messes up all the data. So I guess there was an article that was published by a fellow physician, Dr. Christy Leaf, that she talked about 4 of her biggest concerns right now, and they are the folly of flattening the curve, which I'll go over, the vaccine dream, that we think that we'll have a vaccine for this year. It's not likely that we'll have a vaccine, and I'll go over some of the reasons why she's highlighted that are very important and elucidating. The problem with antibody tests and getting everybody back to work. Again, more evidence is coming forward that a lot of people that are recovered are still shedding. They're still shedding after they've gotten healthy. So they're still maybe going back out into their community, shedding live virus because they have recovered. Their body has antibodies against these viruses, but these viruses are still in the end part of their viability, meaning they're just hanging out in the patient's oropharynx even after the patient has recovered. And there were signals of this that we heard from Chinese doctors, that patients have come in and been tested after recovery, and they were quote unquote reinfected. That was not the case. These patients weren't suffering a second round of infection. They just still had the virus in their oropharynx, and they were still able to shed. So this is new, and this is not great news. That in fact, if you could take the example of a nurse that got sick 2 or 3 weeks ago, taking care of a COVID patient, recovered, and wants to go back to work, well, she could potentially go back to work and be in those environments where she has recovered, but she's shedding potentially contagious virus. 1 second, please. So yeah, that's bad news. That potentially a lot of these patients, nearly 20,000, have recovered and gone home in the United States. They actually could be posing a risk that we were unaware of before. And then she talks about something called the anchoring bias. The anchoring bias is something I want to go over with you. I'm seeing it everywhere, on Facebook, on Twitter, just even in the news. It's seeping out about people grasping for good news, because they want some assurance that this is going to end soon. And unfortunately, I can't agree with a lot of it. I cannot agree with a lot of it. I like the amazing news that we're getting out of medical research centers talking about the development of potential vaccines, potential treatments, the discovery of active agents that actually we know have some sort of molecular basis or reason for having some hope in their effectiveness. There's a lot of that, but there's also a lot of sharing of information, especially on professional networks, where doctors are sharing anecdotal evidence of what's happening. And, the general public doesn't have access to these conversations. What we're seeing is a lot of disinformation. So it's not pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is, really like, how do I describe it? It's using the lexicon of science without using the rigor of science. Okay. So, talking about vibrations and frequencies and how, chakras and things like that. Okay, sure. There's some evidence of yoga having a beneficial effect, and all, plenty of evidence from, all that. But it's, trying to apply the lexicon of science into the realm where there's no evidential basis, that's pseudoscience. Disinformation is totally the much more dangerous thing. It's citing evidence as fact, where the evidence may be, how do I describe it? The evidence is true, but it doesn't correlate to the facts. Okay, so if you might remember that there was a study of men who drink coffee within 30 minutes of waking up, and the study showed that within a certain demographic, the incidence of lung cancer was abnormally high in those people who drink coffee within 30 minutes of waking up. But then when you examined other factors, like whether the patient smokes or has a history of smoking, or also consumes a cigarette with that cup of coffee within 30 minutes of waking up, then you segregate into the population that's truly at risk. It's actually the smokers. It's not the coffee drinkers. So it's the same thing now that we're seeing with, and I'm talking about anchoring bias. It's the same thing we're seeing with hydroxychloroquine and doctors coming forward and saying, yes, I've been, I treated 26 patients with this and 87% of them recovered. Well, the recovery rate of all COVID-19 patients is 98%. So what was it that actually caused them to recover? Was it you giving this this drug, or was it just the natural course of their disease? So yeah.
Let's take a look at a little bit more about what you're talking about here. Give me one second here.
President Trump wants Americans to take an existing drug to fight coronavirus, but as Ben Tracy reports, his advice contradicts Dr. Anthony Fauci and other top scientists who say we simply don't know if it's the right medicine.
We don't have time. We don't have 2 hours. because there are people dying right now.
In a last-minute news conference Sunday night, President Trump repeated that doctors should use the drug hydroxychloroquine, which is not yet proven to treat coronavirus.
They should do it. What really do we have to lose?
Dr. Anthony Fauci has called the drug's effectiveness anecdotal.
I don't think we can definitively say it works.
Over the weekend, Fauci reportedly clashed with the president's economic advisor, Peter Navarro, who said the drug works. The president stepped in when Fauci was asked about the drug at the briefing.
He's your medical expert, correct?
I've answered the question 15 times.
The president says the federal government has now stockpiled 29 million doses of the drug.
What do I know? I'm not a doctor. I'm not a doctor, but I have common sense.
So there we hear a little bit right from the White House about this, and President Trump is saying that he's not a doctor, but you are a doctor. So we're hoping you can maybe give a little bit more background on that.
Okay. So here's the white sheet. We call it the white sheet. This is what the doctors use if they're unfamiliar with a medication. We read the whole thing and go through things like what's its clinical pharmacology, what is it active against, the indications for usage, which is primarily malaria, but it's also used in lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, then the long list of contraindications. So things where you need to look out for the patients that you're prescribing this to. So the ocular effects, the cardiac effects, the effects on the liver, muscles, what tests you should continually do on these patients to monitor them over time, what drugs they interact with, like digoxin, insulin, methotrexate, cyclosporine, ampicillin. So the list is unbelievably long and complicated. This is 17 pages of information on one drug, okay? And here is the 39 pages on azithromycin. Now, I've gone through all of this, and it is both angering me and scaring me that that this is being pushed out into the public. So I don't know how much detail you guys want to know about these drugs, but all I can tell you is that they are not indicated, even though it has been repeatedly said that the FDA has approved them. They stop short in actually saying that they are approved for anything other than lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and malaria. So it is an FDA-approved drug, but you would be using it as a physician, you would be using it what we call off-label, which means use at your own discretion, and that would be something that the FDA basically washes their hands off. So if someone takes you to court, yes, this is FDA approved, but you used it off-label. So there is absolutely no protection for these physicians that are currently prescribing this for off-label use. There's no protection for the patients that take this, and I've also gotten information from friends that are working in New York City that they suspect a number of their patients have died as a result of direct complications from hydroxychloroquine. So, and in the fog of war, you can't really tell, right? You can't tell whether they went into heart failure because of their lungs filling up with fluid, or they went into heart failure because of arrhythmia that was caused by this drug. So when you're in that dangerous a circumstance, why would you ever add additional risk to your patient? It just and on top of that, we hear a lot of what I call the right-wing noise machine picking up this and running this baton and running with it as if it is, they're saying that the scientific community is largely Democrats, largely liberals. They're trying to suppress the efficacy of this drug so it will make the president look bad. No, not at all. In fact, we're just trying to protect patients from what we know could be extremely dangerous. And, Dr. Fauci and others have said there's not enough evidence. But we're being told that these recommendations are based on quote unquote studies from Europe and from China. And these aren't studies. These are experiments. So a 26-person group of patients with no control, no blinding, whose physician is literally fingers crossed hoping that something will work to save a life. That's not a study. That's an experiment. So that's what I have to say about those drugs. Now, let me just go back to this outline and cover some of these points. All right. So, flattening the curve. I think there's a common trend of thought right now that once we go up the curve and start coming down, the case numbers start to decline. The new cases that are discovered in these communities start to decline, and the deaths start to decline, that we as a society are going to be safe to return to our normal lives, our normal pattern of lives. Kids can go to school, people can go to church, and we can go back to shopping in Walmart and whatever. That's not likely what is going to be the safest for these communities. So if you can imagine 100 glasses of water all on a big table, and they're all crystal clear, water. New York City is one of those glasses, and it has been, a red drop of dye has been dropped into it, and it has turned red. The glass forms somewhat of a barrier to it spilling into other communities, other glasses of water. And then ultimately we filter out that red dye from some of these communities. Those other communities, all the way down the line, all 100 cups, glasses of water, are still susceptible. No vaccine, no what we call herd immunity, right? So I've been reading about an approach that's vastly different that's being taken by Sweden and Denmark, or is it the Netherlands? I think it's Netherlands, where they know that containment is only temporary. They know that mitigation is only to protect their healthcare resources and their healthcare system. And so they have already shifted gear to telling their public, educating their public, that a vaccine is 18 months away, and the strongest among you are the ones that are going to have to bite the bullet and likely get sick and provide herd immunity for the rest of our society. My wife Karen and I were talking about it, and we likened it to the first wave of soldiers that go to take, some of them are going to have their legs blown off and they'll live. Some of them are going to die, and some of them are going to make it and become immune, right? But then the next wave that comes to shore, has a greater chance of taking the beach. And that's just, doctors all over the world are now seeing this. So congratulations to Taiwan for stamping it out before, they had the extremely low case fatality rate or case mortality rate of, I think, 8 patients. But now their whole country has to be vigilant for how many months until they can mass vaccinate. So yes, it would have been great to have this contained and then done the mitigation to the point where the virus just kind of is not in these scenarios where it can continue to replicate freely, right? So Taiwan has succeeded in that initial battle, but now it has to fight a war for 18 months minimum until it can mass vaccinate. All right, so that's something people have to, I don't think people have gotten their head around. You know, we have 14,000 cases in Pennsylvania. We have around 800 deaths. For just Pennsylvania to feel safe, I don't think they know what that means. So there's that. Sensitivity and specificity of testing. This is going to be something that, again, you know, there's a reason we don't have a vaccine for the common cold. One, it doesn't kill people. So we really haven't put, you know, billions of dollars in research to come up with a cold vaccine. The other is that adenoviruses, rhinoviruses, even, you know, the coronavirus variant that causes the common cold are so simple that they mutate too quickly for us to actually produce a yearly vaccine. Now, the 50 odd strains of influenza are, obviously they're different from each other, but they don't mutate as rapidly. So we can encapsulate 50 strains into a single vaccine and give it to people on a yearly basis and keep updating the vaccine on a yearly basis if we see certain strains that are novel come into the community and start infecting them with a greater incidence. Coronavirus, it's not going to be very straightforward to create a vaccine, and we'll get there, but not in the next 3, 6, 8 months. No, we already know there's 8 strains, and we don't have them under control. So I probably should show you this. I don't know. I posted this on my wall, but this will give you an idea of what we're fighting. Can everyone see that? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So here's how it traveled, and I'll give you guys the link so you can play with this. But basically, you'll see the initial. You guys can see this, okay?
Yep.
You'll see the initial strain leaving China and traveling to various regions. And then the different colors of strains are the ones that emerged in different regions. All right. And so we have to then track these down. And I can't believe we've done this well, this fast. It took us a decade to do this with HIV. A decade. And we've done it in a matter of 2 months. So you can see all the red ones are the ones that are the strains that are currently being found and sequenced here in the US. Just the reason I'm showing you this is because we have the red strains. What's to say after we have some level of control over the red strains that the European strains, especially the ones that affected Italy and caused an 8% mortality rate, don't appear on our shores in August. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on that one, there's not enough good science reporting. 2, there's not enough focus on, there's a huge amount of focus on what the administration and the government has done wrong. You know, and that can be called, you know, the liberal media bias or whatever, or, you know, always the root cause, analysis that is always done by the media in real time that really is just about pointing fingers. But if we had some real journalism, especially some good science reporting, then we could actually start to educate people about why they need to stay indoors for the next month, because we need to do our very best to control these strains. We need to eradicate as much of this just through social distancing. Now, again, if you haven't understood social distancing, if there's no place for the vector to go, or no place for the virus to go, then it dies. Okay? The more human-to-human contact, the more opportunity it has to continue to be viable within the community. If people stay away from each other for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, we are greatly reducing its ability to continue to be viable. So there's that. And then the bad news that we're hearing is, like, as I have to repeat from earlier in the conversation, is that we're now seeing that shedding is possible even after people have recovered. So this is a new animal altogether. We haven't seen this with flu, nor have we seen this with H1N1, where people recover, go back into the community, and then are still the cause of infection for everyone. So that's not great. So that means, like, if you add up all the numbers, it could be 34 days between the point of acquiring and becoming a carrier to the 14th to 17th day where you are sick. Then, another 15 days for full recovery, and then another 17 days after recovery that you can continue to shed. All right, so imagine, that's maximal, right? Maximal. That's what, 48 days, more than a month and a half, where a person is a risk to everyone around them. So, if that's not in all the cases, there's going to be a bell curve on that too. So there's going to be some segment that really have that long infectivity, long carriership, etc. Then there's others that will not, and they'll get in. They will get the infection in and out of them within a 12 to 18 day span. But we don't know anything about who's going to be the long carrier, who's going to be the short carrier. We're getting more information. I don't know if this information is necessarily accurate yet, but that the African American community infectivity rates are 7 times higher than whites. I don't know, just because we're getting anecdotal evidence from Louisiana. Does that mean that they are more susceptible? Does that mean that their version of the ACE, molecule in their lungs is, somehow of a shape that is more sticky to the virus? This is stuff we learned over the course of a decade with HIV. Everything that we know how to do with viruses is because of HIV.
I think that one of the things that, and as you know, I've worked with people living with HIV in that community a lot in my professional career. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is a huge parallel socioeconomically, I guess, with the view of this. And I know that a lot of the folks that I work with have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder activated from this when they hear terms like not enough testing, or a focus on prevention, or denying that the disease exists by some people, and then coming around to understanding the impact. It's a real kind of history repeating itself kind of phase. So I'm really glad to hear you say that we've learned a lot from the epidemic of HIV to go into this work.
Absolutely, and I will add also discrimination. I think that we've seen hate crimes against Asian Americans. We've seen discrimination even against healthcare workers, not just nurses and doctors, but even people who work in the healthcare environment coming back into their communities where they live and being shunned or being made to feel like they are spreaders just because they're part of the response. And there's just a lot of fear, and the fear is driven by a lack of information, and just, that leads to discriminatory behavior. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. I think I covered as much as I wanted to in terms of flattening the curve, what that means in the short term and long term. Hopes for a vaccine need to be moderated at this point. These antibody tests and about people getting back to work just because they have shown that they were infected and now are immune, that doesn't necessarily mean in the short term they cannot continue to be spreaders. And then obviously the anchoring bias, which is believing in something just because you want to and not because there's evidence for it. So
I think before we go to questions, we want to share a quick video from Pennsylvania Secretary of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, partially so you can all hear it. Secondly, so if people watch the video of this, they get it before they tune out. So let's show that quick, and then we'll come back for some questions, okay?
Great. Okay, so I will make a recommendation that may or may not be controversial, I don't know. Gloves are not necessary, especially if you are, like for example, you go to the supermarket, right? And you feel like everybody's touching this stuff, I don't want to touch it. In that case, it's fine, but don't wear those gloves home. Don't even wear them back into your car. They need to be discarded as soon as you leave the grocery store. That's fine, but walking around with gloves or driving your car with gloves, don't do that. The gloves will just become contaminated, and then you're essentially going around spreading it using the gloves. The mask always when you're any venue that is high traffic. And anywhere where you anticipate somebody's going to be passing by, walking, anywhere like that would be ideal for you to wear some form of face covering. And to a certain extent, two reasons, obviously. One is if you are infected and asymptomatic, you don't know it. There's evidence that a large number of people could be asymptomatic carriers and not even proceed to the disease. They'll just have it. The virus will be detectable, and then they won't have it a week later, or 10 days, or 12 days later. They'll never develop the disease because the virus never took hold in their lower respiratory system. Okay, so during that phase, if you sneeze, you are potentially shedding it. All right? If you cough, you sneeze in public, you're potentially shedding it. So everyone should be wearing a face covering so that inadvertently, if they are sneezing, coughing, or breathing close to others and they're infected, that greatly reduces the ability for the virus to spread. The second reason is obviously inbound. So if you're in an environment where hundreds of people have walked in and out in the last 3 hours, you should afford yourself some protection for the areas of your face where the virus can most likely take hold. That does include your eyes, but it's really mostly the mouth and nose.
Are glasses good enough?
I wouldn't say they are. Eyeglasses, there's a huge amount of air flow in and around the frame. So, yeah. in a like a clinical environment, like an ER, where we wear the goggles, have a seal, a complete seal around them. So yeah, those are the only ones that are truly protective. But the other thing to remember is that a clinical environment is filthy. Is just, there's the you know, if you've heard the term parts per million of something, the parts per million of infective, you know, potentially infective particles in an ER or any clinical, like a hospital room, is exponentially higher than, you know, your grocery store or your gas station. People don't realize that the hospital is actually one of the most dangerous places to be. What? Yeah.
Can you hear me, Sanjay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was going to say the hospital is one of the worst places to be.
Yeah.
I had earlier in March, I had several appointments. And one night I was going to have a procedure for my back, and to get a shot for back pain, and I canceled it. I said, I'm not going. This is a Cleveland clinic, and I said, I'm not going anywhere near a hospital until they get this sorted out. This was before, I guess we've learned a lot in the last 3 weeks. But when you call the Cleveland Clinic, at least the people on the front line who were answering the phones weren't that knowledgeable about what was going on, so they couldn't really answer your questions. And I just felt that, well, even if they know what they're talking about, you know, in the hierarchy of the clinic, it's not getting out to the people who are communicating with the public. And I thought, well, until they get something in place a little better, I wasn't going to go in there and risk that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the remarkable things that I've seen recently was the interview with Chris Cuomo. He's suffering at home in his basement and reporting. And Dr. Sanjay Gupta did an interview with him, but he had his own little 5-minute description of how things were going for him and how to fight it. And I think, you know, it's very indicative of how, you know, 90 to 95% of people who get sick are going to have to fight this virus. They're going to have to fight it as if it's the worst flu of their life. They're going to have to isolate at home. They're going to have to have a caregiver, you know, extraordinarily aware of their minute-to-minute condition in case it deteriorates to the point where breathing is difficult. And only then will they end up going to the hospital. You may carry a fever of 102 plus for 8 to 10 days, you know, rising and falling. People are losing. I'm talking to patients that have lost 12 pounds in a period of a week. You know, just the cycle of fever and chills and rigor, and that is what inevitably hundreds of thousands of people in the United States are going to go through in the next 3 to 6 months. And unfortunately, a small percentage, which again, my calculations are about 6.5%, are going to end up in the hospital. Of those 6.5%, right now the trend is about 1.5% of those 6.5% are going to succumb to the severest form of this disease, which is acute respiratory distress caused by fulminant pneumonia. And that is made that will be accelerated by any underlying condition that you may have related to cardiovascular health. If you have any previous lung damage, if you have any previous history of cardiac arrhythmia, cardiomyopathy, any heart disease could result in the course of the disease being extremely bad for you. So
you had mentioned that people with existing conditions. What is the risk of, the risk of both infection and symptoms and severity for smokers versus non-smokers?
at least a 40% greater risk of the worst course of the disease or an extremely harmful course of the disease. So, it's not a death sentence, but 40% worse than a person that's never smoked. It's just because the clearance, the simplest reason is the clearance. Smoking causes the little hairs, which we call cilia, inside of the lung bronchioles, that pick up and get rid of all of the dust and dirt that normally comes in through your, oropharynx. It gets rid of it. It pulls it up out of your lungs, even dead tissues and the dead lung cells and things like that. It's a cleaning mechanism, and smokers have a much diminished ability to get rid of those, the detritus of daily living. It's just they're not efficient. So that's why you get smoker's cough and all that other stuff. But that's the simplest reason. It's just once the infection it takes grip, a healthy lung is able to get rid of, the dead white cells and the dead mucus cells of the linings of the lung, and get it up and out in a very much more efficient way than a smoker. And the same is true for patients that have certain autoimmune conditions and certain congenital conditions like cystic fibrosis. It's just that one physical aspect of their lungs being able to clear debris. A normal lung is pretty efficient. A smoker or a diseased lung is not.
Is someone who's infected who shows severe symptoms more likely to transmit the disease than someone who's asymptomatic, or are they equal?
Great question. Absolutely not. They're equal. Yeah. Totally asymptomatic, the virus is replicating and shedding, and you're totally fine, walking around happy. And then there's someone in their basement with 103 fever, with impending pneumonia, and they could be equally infective.
Hey, Sanjay, I had wondering, have you seen any numbers on statistics coming out of New York? I could have sworn I seen something today on it. And they were attributing higher number male to female on deaths, 61% to 39%.
That's correct.
And then they were also saying that two big underlying causes that they were attributing to deaths were hypertension and diabetes.
Correct. Absolutely true. Yep. Again, so we have arteries, big blood vessels. You can see them in your arm. We have the largest arteries, the aorta, the ascending abdominal aorta, but these break down into smaller arteries that go all over your body, and then they break down into extremely small vessels called capillaries. So in those with diabetes and hypertension, the health of those capillaries, the fragility of those capillaries is very poor, and they're not resilient. We have a condition called microangiopathy in patients with longstanding diabetes and longstanding hypertension, where even a slight perturbation, a slight disturbance in the health of that vascular bed can cause it to become extremely inefficient in getting rid of carbon dioxide and supplying the tissue with oxygen. This is typical in patients with hypertension and diabetes. So you can imagine when their bodies get stressed by a virus, their tissues do not respond well. They undergo that much higher level of oxidative stress and inability to clear the results of the infection, and their course of disease is much worse.
And one other thing I read in the same article that a lot of the home patients who have passed, it's not being attributed because of the still lack of testing. So a lot of people it's being ruled like a natural cause instead of actually testing and saying that this person passed from COVID-19. So again, the numbers are going to be so skewed that.
Yeah, the surveillance aspect of the impact of the disease and who's dying of what, and whether we can attribute it directly to an infection by CV19 is terrible. There are no standards state to state. The feds have not let out a guideline for all doctors to adhere to, and deaths at home should be tested. They definitely should be tested, but we're not doing that. We don't have a national protocol in place for data collection to be normalized and uniform.
We do have people who have stock in Sanofi. Is that the French name of it? Yeah, Sanofi. Yeah, they own some stock in it, so that's good. Yeah.
Here's additional bad news. If you're diabetic and you have hypertension or some cardiovascular disease, especially cardiac, you should not take hydroxychloroquine. So even if it was effective, it's going to be not just not effective if it's not, but it's going to be highly detrimental to those with diabetes and hypertension.
Yeah.
That's why it should not be. First of all, it should not be being pushed by the president. Second of all, it's just the science behind it doesn't merit.
Hey, I'll have you know he has Rudy Giuliani acting as his health and science expert. So watch what you say there, buddy.
Yeah, I heard Rudy's gathering evidence. That's great.
Yeah.
A recent NPR Marist poll, NewsHour poll, had ranked where people trust the information they hear about the coronavirus. Trump did do so well, but I think that overall, let's see if I can do math. I should be able to do math. 87% of Americans are really leaning on public health experts for this. Unfortunately, they are also getting information from not public health experts. So if only they would just get their information from public health experts and not other sources. So I think that is
John, though,
interesting.
What's your opinion on the availability of science reporting? I mean, yes, there are certain outlets that are definitely putting these health officials out and giving them plenty of airtime, NPR and PBS, obviously, and to a certain extent some of the mainstream ones. But more than anything, I'm just hearing political reporting and very, very, very little like informational science reporting.
So in the news industry, in broadcasting, you've got magazine shows that I think, or specials, and I have seen every night for about an hour, CNN, MSNBC, even the Fox News channel, they do, what happened today, and they start a lead-in, like I showed the CBS News clip, that's talking about this push for the allowing these different medications to be used. And then they do go into very, very much a science-based reporting segment. But you see that at like 11 o'clock at night on the news, for half hour or an hour And then we go back to the political fighting and arguing and
Yeah.
And quite honestly, I get 95% of my news from the sources you mentioned. So I used to work in public broadcasting, so I'm a little biased towards that.
I wish everybody were biased towards that, to tell you honestly.
I think that so here's another question. There's varying sources that say different things about the lifespan of the virus when it is not in an active host. So I guess I'd back that up and share with not just the folks here on the Zoom, but the people who are going to be watching this on the stream. Take us back to fourth grade science class. Okay, take us back to fourth grade science class and tell, like, there's differences between bacteria and virus and all of that, and how do we get sick? We either get a bacterial infection or a viral infection or a coronaviral infection or a whatever. Can you take us back to just some of that basic science and then kind of talk through how we get rid of this thing?
Okay, great. Absolutely, sure. So the most common, symbiotic organism with our body is bacteria, right? We have bacteria all over our skin, in our mouths. We have it in our gastrointestinal system. In fact, bacteria produce vitamin K, which is an absolutely crucial vitamin in regulating some of the pathways for clotting in our blood. So without those beneficial bacteria, life as we know it is not possible. So we have that symbiotic relationship with bacteria. We call them beneficial bacteria, or the gut flora, or what we now know as our own microbiome. Okay. Now, these bacteria come from different families, but the two bacteria that are very, detrimental to us are Streptococcus, Staphylococcus. We've heard those terms many times. I got a strep throat, or I got a staph infection from some abrasion or something like that, right? So we've heard those terms, staph and strep. But that's what they are. They are the bacteria that have some infectivity. And if I could demonstrate, I would say that if a bacteria is about the size of this cell phone, okay, a virus is submicroscopic to even what I'm trying to show you. All right. If you put a virus next to this size, and this size represents bacteria, you cannot even see the virus. That's how small the virus is. All right. So under a microscope, at 10,000x, I can see this bacteria. I can identify its shape. I can identify some of its features, like what's on its cell wall. Is it motile? Can it move about in a culture? What's its shape? Is it like shaped like a grape? So that would be a coccus. Is it shaped like a rod? That's a bacillus. So, and then we have other ways of describing its characteristics physically. That tells us how we might be able to treat it with a specific antibiotic. Okay. Without getting into the technical details, that's a lot about a lot of what we do in terms of treating patients with bacterial infections is, taking a swab or a blood culture or some urine culture or whatever, putting it in a petri dish, letting it grow, examining it for its physical features, and then identifying it, almost like the breed of a dog, right? Golden Retriever or whatever. By looking at it, we know a lot about its characteristics and its life cycle. And we've identified these over the last 100 or 200 years of observing them. Now, viruses will infect even bacteria. Okay, so viruses are so small that if you were to look into a microscope, and identify a single bacteria, and it was surrounded by viruses, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see the vast majority of viruses. Some viruses are big, and some viruses are tiny. Okay, so we have lots of names for these viruses. We have retroviruses, and as John said, coronavirus, adenovirus, rhinovirus, picornavirus, and they all have their own physical characteristics, but they're divided into two. Okay, there's two worlds of viruses. There's the RNA virus, which are very, very simple. There's the DNA viruses that are much more complex. There are viruses that infect plants. There are viruses that infect bacteria, like I said, and there are viruses that infect large multicellular organisms like us. All right. So why is an antibiotic not effective against a virus? But it is, like penicillin. I can give penicillin, I can clear a gonorrhea infection or a chlamydia infection, or I can give this chemical that we have found, derived, purified, and we call it an antibiotic. We can give it in a pill form, and I can clear a bacterial infection with that medicine. But I can't do that right now with a vast majority of viruses. One of the reasons is that the discovery of a lot of antibiotics actually came from the natural world, right? Penicillin was discovered as a biological weapon developed in the war between fungus and bacteria. So penicillin was found in a bread mold, purified, and we noticed there was no bacteria growing where the fungus grew. Why? Well, we found out that if we used whatever chemical that the fungus was creating, inherently, that it was active against bacterial infections. Have we found anything like that that's effective in the viral world? No. Very, very few compounds that are naturally occurring are effective against viruses. So we really don't have a repertoire to learn from in nature to have something that is useful against viruses, especially the super simple viruses like RNA viruses, like HIV, which again, I go back to, is where we have learned the vast majority of how to treat viruses, how to develop medicines against viruses. All right, so because of its inherent size, bacteria have weapons to protect themselves with. They have toxins, they have proteins, they have big, thick walls. Tuberculosis protects itself with a big, big, thick protein, glycoprotein wall all the way around the bacteria, okay? And anytime you soak this bacteria in a certain antibiotic, it just bounces off the wall, okay? So that's why we have to give extremely high doses of antibiotics to tackle tuberculosis. And even then, tuberculosis has come up with ways to fight antibiotics. We have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. We have multi-drug resistant Staph aureus. We have methicillin resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, right? So antibiotics can be fought by bacteria. Certain chemical agents are not necessarily effective against bacteria. You can wash the hell out of your hands and still, MRSA will still be there. But viruses, because of their inherent size and their fragility, they are susceptible to chemicals much more than antibiotics. So Clorox, hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, and even detergents are really highly effective against viruses because they're so simple. All they are is a ball of mostly what we would call fats, okay? With, you've seen the picture of the coronavirus with the red crown, so to speak. Those are proteins, and those proteins help it bind to various sites within the body. But when you wash it, yeah, there we go. When you can see that the white part of that virus there is the fat. We call it the lipid bilayer. And if you've ever seen, you got a greasy bowl and you put some water in it and you put a drop of Dawn and it clears it out. Obviously, you've seen that in commercials or even in real life. Detergents have that effect of dissolving fats very quickly. So soap is very, very effective against viruses. So is alcohol, so is hydrogen peroxide. Thank you, John. And the proteins then come apart and the RNA inside is exposed and the whole thing falls apart. This isn't always necessarily true with a much more complex, much more physically strong microbe like bacteria. But with viruses, they're easy to chemically kill. John, did that help or?
Yeah, I think so. I guess the next step would be, so we have a influenza vaccine. Right?
Yes.
So how does that work against the influenza vaccine, and then how would something similar like that eventually work against this?
Okay, excellent. So vaccines are complicated things. We have the first, really amazingly effective vaccine many of you know about is polio, right? Where we take a bunch of the fragments of the polio virus and we dissolve it in a solution, present it to the body. Now we have a nasal version of that, nasal spray. And then the body activates its immune system to produce the requisite, what we call surveillance antibodies against polio. And then you have lifelong resistance, lifelong protection from the polio vaccine. Polio is one of those simple viruses that doesn't mutate often. Therefore, very few strains can then be dissolved and then a huge population can be protected against polio. The flu vaccine is slightly more complicated because, as I mentioned, we have to keep up with the times. The polio virus hasn't mutated. It hasn't had an opportunity to infect and then create new generations and new strains because we essentially eradicated polio, right? We gave it to everybody we gave the vaccine to everybody in the world, and then generations later, it's hard, if not impossible, to find polio vaccine in the wild because there's no one that it can infect and replicate it. In flu, that's not the case, right? So we have not eradicated flu. We have huge populations of people all over the world that get infected by flu every year. That gives flu the opportunity to mutate every generation. And as I said, a virus generation can be as short as 5 hours. Okay, it takes 25 years for human beings to have a generation. It can be as short as 5 hours for a virus. So you can imagine their characteristics can mutate very quickly. And then they can become very different from where they were just a year ago. They can look genetically, physically different, both from a molecular perspective, but also to the human body. So I got infected with the flu last year, right? That doesn't necessarily mean I'm immune from the flu this year, right? So that's why we ask everybody to get their yearly flu shot, because what we do is we take last year's flu virus and we include it in this year's flu vaccine. But that doesn't mean that this year's flu isn't different from that one. So the vaccine that we're giving for flu confers protection for about 90% of what you will encounter. It gives you 90% chance to go through the season without getting the flu, right? And then we have to do it all over again for the next year. If we find a new variant, a new strain, we have to include that in the vaccine that we're going to produce and give to people next year. So it's a constant fight against to immunize, number one, and to immunize with the appropriate strains that are going to be in the wild and people are going to encounter year to year. So coming to coronavirus. it's more than likely, it's actually very likely that SARS, let's call it SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome caused by coronavirus. So we have flu, now we're going to have SARS. We're going to have to give a SARS vaccine every year, globally. And 5 years ago, a lot of researchers in Texas, in Pittsburgh, in Israel, were on the cusp of delivering or creating a SARS vaccine, but it's not commercially useful, right? I mean, we didn't have a huge numbers of people getting infected by SARS. So why would a company invest in, $1 billion in creating a lab to do a yearly SARS vaccine? Nobody wanted to invest that. Well, they'll be investing now. And we're probably going to see a yearly SARS vaccine along with your yearly flu vaccine.
Sanjay?
Yeah.
All right. So you showed us the graph earlier with the 8 different strains that are
Yes.
going around the globe. So each vaccine is going to be tailored to one of those 8 strains based on where it was, or?
No, we're going to put all of the strains in one vaccine and we're going to give it to everybody. And then as those strains mutate year to year, we're going to keep up with that. So it wouldn't make any sense to give Americans only a vaccine for the American strain, because the Italian strain could come over and,
Yeah, but you can make more money that way.
True. Don't tell anybody about the Udoshi Munt vaccine venture that we're...
I'm in. Hey, well, I'll show you a little hack I got.
Yeah.
When I go into the store, I don't use gloves.
Yeah.
But when I come out to the car, I use these. They're eyeglass cleaners made out of 100% alcohol.
Yes.
And they're still pretty widely available.
Yeah.
So if you can't find hand cleanser, buy a box of these and keep it in your car. And before you do anything, wipe it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Your steering wheel, very
Good idea.
important. Yeah, keep your steering wheel clean. That's very important. John asked a question about how long. I should have ended my thing about viruses. How long is it viable, right? So, like I said, bacteria are pretty hardy. They can hang around for days, weeks, even longer. Metabolically, they don't require a lot of food. Viruses are even worse. Viruses, there's a debate whether they're even alive, that they're just organic and they're self-replicating, but are they living? Because do they consume oxygen? Do they need glucose? What do they eat? What do they breathe? That kind of thing. So certain viruses, are hardy, but we don't know yet how hardy coronavirus is, especially this coronavirus. We get evidence that it can hang out in the oropharynx without replicating for up to 15 to 17 days. It can hang out on metal surfaces, again, for about 15 to 18 days. The guys that went onto that Concordia, what is it, the Princess or something, that ship from the CDC, and were doing samples off of the handrails and the bathrooms, and it was like 16 days later, they found viable virus hanging out on the ship, right? That are still in the condition to be infective. So, right now, I guess, what I'm doing that's haven't started with the shoes yet, because we just haven't been going out. My boys are home, schooling at home. They're sick of being home. Karen has been going out, but she keeps her work clothes there, and then she has a decontamination area where she changes and comes off. Soap water, literally putting your hands in water, Dawn soap, and It's kind of hot to the touch for just about 120 seconds to make sure that there's absolutely no viral particles, and then washing up, scrubbing down. It's very effective. You don't need anything special. So just a tub of soap water for anything you need to decontaminate. Handles, doorknobs, be very wary of those things.
I clean my doorknobs like crazily.
What? Yeah. So, any other questions?
Now, we had heard that tracking stuff in with your shoes or boots or whatever was a way it was getting through the door.
Yes.
Carpet, synthetic fibers, long lifespan. So that's the first thing that comes off and gets sprayed down. I work in a facility with 160 people, and walking in and out every day, different doorways, different whatever. So it's, and I've got no choice about it. So unless I want to quit, so.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah.
So wait for that stimulus check to come in.
Yeah. Everybody's going to run out and buy toilet paper.
Yeah. $1,200 worth.
Exactly.
Which will do them great in 2022, but.
Oh, man.
It's one check. It isn't like, it's the littlest Band-Aid at all you can put on the 10 million people who just lost their jobs. Here, had $1,200, pay your rent, now you're broke again.
Yeah. It's just the whole response to this. Well, there's some we have this new way of looking at systems in biology, and we call it perturbation modeling, right? Where you build a model and then you hit it with things that perturb its ideal state. Now, let me give you a rough example. We have hospitals that are part of what they call group buying organizations, and they all aggregate their needs and then buy it from one vendor. That one vendor keeps all 600 hospitals supplied or 60 hospitals supplied, depending on how big that group is. That is a very complex logistics system, and in order to maximize profit for everybody involved, you don't keep anything for more than 3 days in a warehouse. There's no point in keeping something that's not going to be used for more than 3 days. So you just keep that amount of stock in the system, and then that gets replaced within 3 days, right? So you don't have stuff just sitting in a warehouse gathering dust, not making profit for you. Now, what happens when you perturb that model? Nobody has done that, right? Nobody just went along and said, here, let me flick the ear and see what happens. What's the reaction? And now somebody came by with a machete and cut off the ear, all right? And it's bleeding now. I mean, this is what happens, when you've built a system and its entire goal is profit for everybody. All right, instead of delivery of service or quality of service or reliability of service, none of those are part of the equation, and it's only profit. Perturbing it is what we've just seen. What happens is what we've just seen. The whole thing collapses. Everything from ground floor up collapses. And I hope this teaches us a lesson. I doubt it will. What was it? The Great Recession taught us nothing. And I don't know that this will either. So
Depressing.
I think what people were used to a year ago won't exist again for another 10 years.
yeah,
We've dug up to the very base of the foundation, and everyone's going to expect all the bricks to fall back into the exact same place they were a year ago.
No.
It's physically impossible to go back to that this year, next year, the year after.
No, absolutely not. Not possible. Not for the healthcare system, not for society, not for public policy, and not for politics in general.
Yeah.
Just we lived in a pre 9/11 era. We lived in a post 9/11 era. Now we're going to live in a post pandemic era.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about testing.
Sure. 3 types of testing. One is a detection test, and that is the first version that you saw everywhere with the nasal swab. And basically, we would take the nasal swab and put it in a machine that would tell us whether the RNA that is a signature of that particular virus was present. And it's very accurate. It's very accurate if indeed the swab comes in contact with the virus. If it doesn't, then you will get a false negative. The virus is not going to be uniformly within the mucous membranes of the entire nose, sinus, and oropharynx. It may just be hibernating or in a patch, or it may have gone inside the sinus and could be hiding. Okay, so there's the accuracy of the test is very high, the precision is not. The second test is a serological test, and that is going to tell us whether you've been exposed to the virus, one, and whether there was an immune response to the virus. All right, so that means that someone that has very early on in February went through a 5-day or an 8-day flu, didn't know what the hell was going on, but recovered, no problem. Like I said, 98% of people are going to recover from this. Recovered and back in their daily life, would like to know whether actually they did suffer from this particular infection, this particular virus. So they can get a serological test, which is a blood test, looking for antibodies that say to us, scientifically, that this person had the virus and now has antibodies against the virus, right? That's the signature of the immune response that your body has to an infection or a vaccination. Third one is a class segregation. Okay, antibodies come in different classes: IgE, IgM, IgE, D, A. IgM is called a sentinel antibody. It's five prongs, pentamer, floats around your body, and it is the one that is a detection antibody. Then that switches over to IgG, which is just a single Y-shaped molecule that floats around your body, that basically says, I'm immune. Okay, not just exposed, but I'm immune. I've gone through the entire cycle of either 4 weeks, 6 weeks later, the classes of antibodies switch inside your body, and then it basically says, I can, whatever virus hit me, I will not succumb to that again because I have immunity to that virus. So 3 tests: detection, exposure, and then immunity.
So curious, smart.
When this, really started hitting the fan, they were talking about all these different tests that were being made, or to see which would be viable. Do you have an idea how many different tests just for testing for the virus? Like I've heard 2-hour test, 15-minute test, and then one you don't get back for 3 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first one, the detection test that was first available was a a 2 to 4 day test because you had to do a lot of things with that swab. You had to get the get the swab to an appropriate lab. The lab had to have an appropriate process for separating the human cells and from the virus particles. Then take the virus particles and put it through a machine that amplifies it, and then you detect it. It takes a long time. Then there's the one that's like that's now available. It's just like a color test. So you take the sample and you put it on, and then 5 to 15 minutes later, based on whether the line is colored or not, we have the detection of the virus itself. I think it's a protein test, and then obviously the serological test does take a little bit longer, but it can be done in 2 hours. So the Abbott test that they were promoting, it's a little box and you put the sample in. It's a color test that gives results in less than 15 minutes. And then the little color block test, less than 5 minutes. The only problem is we don't know, again, difference between accuracy and precision, difference between sensitivity and specificity. These are all kind of scientific terms that we use to say this is a valid test. Number 2, it is an accurate test, and number 3, the results are trustworthy. We haven't standardized that yet. We're out there trying to just figure out how many people have it or could have it or are sick with it.
Do we know what the exposure to seroconversion timeline is?
Exposure seroconversion is still around 4 to 6 weeks.
So you could have something for a month and not start producing antibodies, or?
Yes.
No.
Mm-hmm. It has to go through that process, right? It has to. This is a 4-hour lecture, John, on on how your T cells get involved and how they have to activate your B cells to start producing antibodies, and seroconversion happens. But that process needs to have occurred, and you don't necessarily go through that process even if you're carrying. Yeah.
And that's going to be different person to person.
Correct. But once activated, you're right, it's still standard 4 to 6 weeks. This is a weird bug. It's a weird bug. And I'm even getting reports that it's not just the lungs. It's going after the heart. It's going after the myocardium.
Wow.
Yeah, and then we're not even getting accuracy on, why are children spared?
I had heard that the children were not being spared necessarily. That was one of those statistics that wasn't really being held up.
I don't know yet. I know that we've had a 16-year-old victim, an 18-year-old victim, a 4-week-old, and a 6-week-old. But I mean, H1N1 was murderous. H5N1 was also murderous. Did not spare children. So we have to see.
That was 11 years ago, right? Sure. Yeah. I think that let me ask a sociological point of view question here. You had mentioned earlier this evening that incidences in communities of color were higher, and and from a socioeconomic standpoint, just based on the history of our nation's treatment of people of color and minorities, I think that you're going to find that there are more socioeconomical dependencies on people going to work, whether or not it's the right thing to do. So I wonder if the flip side of that is true, given the media focus on this, given the kind of global, well, absolutely, the global focus on this. Is it possible that children are less likely to be infected because, you know, you might go out and go to work, your, you know, Karen goes to work. There's no way you're going to let your kids go out and play with other kids. There's no way you're going to take them to, unless you're not quite thinking clearly or believing everything that's going on in the world right now. You're not going to send your kids to Chuck E. Cheese to jump in a ball pit with other kids.
Or you can't afford to. Yeah.
Right.
So, one thing that I'm really proud of the healthcare community in the last 10 years, and also the people like my colleagues who have worked in data in the very vilified electronic medical record. There are some good things about it, and that is standardization of data collection, for example. So when doctors are intaking patients in a large medical environment, and now even in small medical environments, we have the requirement, obviously, to take down their demographics. And then there's a great debate over what are demographics. So to stop, you know, to actually draw a line of delineation between demographics and other data of importance, we have come up with a group of characteristics which we call social determinants of health. Okay, so yeah, we know a lot about a person based on their age, sex, race, etc. But we know a lot more about that person if we know what's their education level, how many people do they live with, what's their monthly budget, in fact, on food, how much do they spend on food, how much do they spend on their utilities, can they access a medication based on its cost, you know, how much do they spend on their current medications. These are social determinants of health, right? Someone with the means and ability have all of those check marks, you know, as positive social determinants of health, right? They can afford stuff. They you know, their outlay just is not going to their monthly outlays for necessities isn't going to preclude them from getting or acquiring the appropriate health needs. But then, like you brought up, John, you have communities that largely have very poor social determinants of health. They have to spend a majority of their income on the basics. They do not have access to not only information, but if prescribed, they don't even have access. They can't afford the standards of care. Okay, and that can be hypertension, it can be diabetes, it can be obesity, nutrition, anything. So, like I said, you know, we only learned about this when we tried to standardize data collection. Before that, doctors didn't really address or take down this information or collect it or analyze it or even bother about it. But the more granular the evidence becomes, the more you start to see the patterns of why and how certain groups of patients in certain communities, and especially certain ethnicities, are adversely affected by various health trends. Now we know what a pandemic does or can do to a majority Black, highly affected by obesity, hypertension, and diabetes community in Louisiana that lives paycheck to paycheck in close quarters with each other, right? We start to see that they've got a target on their backs for this virus, and that, you know, they could line up for testing and they'll just end up giving the virus to each other. So yeah, clearly that community it has a huge target on its back compared to where I live. Northeastern Pennsylvania, natural social distance between families, even in my neighborhood, access to anything and everything, nutritionally, education, everything,
With a lot of the testing that's gone on, and it's people are pretty knowledgeable about it now, is that they're going to test you for coronavirus for free. But to get that test, you also have to be tested for flu and strep, and those tests aren't free. So a lot of communities where there isn't money are looking at paying $5,000 to $2,000 for testing before they could actually get the coronavirus testing. That's stopping people from going to get tested. It really is happening.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
I think that I work with a number of organizations, including several free clinics, and I think that one of the amazing things that's kind of happened in healthcare, in economic healthcare, over the last 10 years, is the establishment of these clinics that are specifically there for the uninsured and underinsured. And I know, I'm working with a clinic in York, Pennsylvania right now, and they have people that come in and they need their Toprol or their metformin or their insulin or whatnot. And, thanks to the generosity of their supporters and donors, are able to provide a lot of that for free or at very, very low cost in partnership, sometimes with the pharmaceutical companies, but oftentimes through other programs. So I think there are certainly resources out there. So it's important that we look at that, look at those resources and help where we can. I also think that one of the things that we need to remind people of who are watching this and who are caring for themselves and or others, as we don't leave our house. I don't know how many times people that I've been on these conversations with say, I don't even know what day it is.
Yeah.
So the days tend to all run together. So it's also important to check on people who are dealing with chronic health issues. Make sure they're taking their medicine every day when they need to take that. Make sure that they're you're just checking in with them, making sure they're okay, but reminding them, hey, did you take your medication today? It's now, what is it, Tuesday?
Yeah.
Oh, I talked to someone who's like, oh man, I haven't taken my blood pressure medicine since like Sunday. Like, oh, well, you should probably do that and follow the guidelines on whether you should take extra or just get caught up or whatnot. I think that is something that this is having an unintended effect on folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that my colleagues that are working every day, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, in the clinical environments, and I don't work in a clinical environment. I'm a consultant on the population health and clinical genomics side of things, data, evidence, clinical informatics. My colleagues who I adore that are out there, they're stressed, and a lot of them are having to take care of their community needs, and that keeps them away from their daily program, looking after their patients. So, I mean, whatever we can do to assist and take up the slack. Even my friends on Facebook, some of them are elderly, to just be there to answer questions and help them through the day and the week. And like you said, ensure that they are keeping with their prescribed, medication regimen, and um, and also staying mentally strong. I see a lot of depression creeping through. A lot of people who are very, very saddened, despondent, lonely. These are important. They're very important. They produce an additional burden on top of the physical. They produce a burden that is kind of indefinable and even harder to address. But it is, and it's so hard because you can't walk over there and give them a hug. You can't do the things that you would normally do that are part of being human with others. So we just have to do our best to keep even more communicative and involved with each other. If you see some alarming posts or some despondency and things like that, don't scroll past it. Try to look into it.
Yeah, I think another thing that I've been telling people to do is, social distancing doesn't mean stay in your house. Although shelter in place can have that sort of view. And WNEP, the local AVC affiliate, put together a really nice piece on social distancing, but getting outside. So I'd like to share that now. We'll show that quick, and then we'll come back, and we're coming up on our time here, so we will wrap up after that. So have a watch at this, and we'll be back in a minute.